Hello, my name is Matthew Harrison, and I'm talking to you today from the heart of Canada. My guest today is Niigaan Sinclair. Niigaan is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press, as well as a professor of Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. At the end of May, Niigaan published a book called Winipek, Visions of Canada from an Indigenous Centre. Niigaan, thanks for coming to talk to me today.
Miigwech, thanks for having me. It's nice to be on your podcast.
What inspired you to write this book?
I've been writing for the Winnipeg Free Press since 2018, so going on 6 years now. I was hired originally to be the city columnist. What happened was a very famous, long-standing columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press, Niigaan Sinclair, who was a city columnist for decades, retired, and there was an opening at the Winnipeg Free Press, and I had been writing sort of freelance a little bit for the Free Press, and the editor, Paul Samin, asked me to sort of audition or try out or apply for the job of being a columnist, and then I was asked to be the city columnist, which means to talk about life in the city and to talk about the culture of the city and to talk about kind of the different experiences of the city. I can't do that full time because I'm already a professor at the University of Manitoba. So I took that job part-time, meaning 1 to 2, sometimes 3 columns a week. And I've been doing that for about 6 years. And after about 6 months, I was lucky enough to win a Canadian Columnist of the Year. And so it was a very prestigious moment, kind of a shocking moment, frankly, because I didn't expect to get so much attention so early. And so ever since then, I've had kind of people approach me, different publishers, to get my columns together. Eventually, I succumbed to a conversation with Penguin, Random House Canada. And Penguin has an imprint, McClellan and Stewart, and they offered me a book deal, 2-book deal actually. So I have a second book with them, and to put my columns together. And so then we started the process of trying to figure out like what really this book would be about. And there's nothing better or nothing, of course, more important that I've been writing about than Winnipeg and the life here, the struggles here, but also the fact that the city is ground zero for Canada's most important project of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples.
Why would you say Winnipeg is ground zero for that?
Winnipeg is the first footstep of Canada. We know that Canada didn't come out of nowhere. It came from the Upper Canada, Lower Canada kind of conglomeration. There was a very famous meeting with Sir Rodney MacDonald in Prince Edward Island just before Confederation of 1867. We know about the history and the battles between the British and the French and kind of the ostracization of Quebec and then the War of 1812. And so we sort of know these nation-making moments for Canada. But the first footstep of the country comes after Confederation of 1867 in really 2 moments. So 1870, the Manitoba Act, after the Métis here, the provisional government led by Louis Riel, declare independence and also flirt with joining the United States, this territory. And Manitoba enters Confederation, become the famous postage stamp province, which was built off the treaty, the Pegwis-Selkirk Treaty of 1817, the boundaries of that treaty. Then eventually leads to 1871, the negotiation of Treaty 1 and Treaty 2, which in many ways expands the borders of the postage stamp province into Indigenous territories among the Assiniboine River, the Red River. We have always been the place in which Canada has imposed laws, policies, practices, which have been for a long period inherently racist. The Indian Act, the undermining of the numbered treaties, the scrip policy, which removed land from Métis peoples. And so we have inherited from day one of this country the violence against Indigenous peoples. That means we've been at this the longest. We've been the most amount of, for instance, residential schools or legacies from residential schools that manifest themselves into the child welfare system in Manitoba. 90% of the child welfare system is Indigenous children. About 90% of the youth justice, youth in jail are Indigenous. About 40% of the inmates in the federal penitentiary just up the road in Stony Mountain are Indigenous. The great amount of people in the justice system, health system, all the different systems that have come and indoctrinated themselves in this place have always come out with a basic premise, which is that Canadians matter. But Indigenous peoples don't matter. Indigenous peoples are second-tier citizens. Indigenous peoples are savage, uncivilized problems that Canadians have to solve in some way. We've been at this for just a long period of time. It's almost like a normal way of life here, and that's why we have massive amounts of encampments of Indigenous people sleeping outside. We have more Indigenous peoples dying due to diabetes or cancers in the healthcare system. We have more Indigenous peoples who are sitting in jails than anywhere else in the country. But we also have been at the solutions the longest, because it's not just about Indigenous peoples who have been resisting Canada's policies and practices of racism, but it's also our neighbors, our friends, our families that have joined with us. And that I come from a very Manitoba family. My father is Ojibwe and Cree from Peguis and Norway House, both First Nations. But my mother is British and French, going all the way back to Quebec and going all the way back to England. I come from kind of the prototypical Manitoba family that we're all mixed together for multiple generations. And therefore, it's not just about Indigenous peoples who have been resisting, coming up with innovative solutions for the Indian Act or legacies of residential schools or violence with policing, et cetera. It's also about our neighbors who have witnessed those things and are walking alongside us here in Manitoba farther and longer than almost anywhere else in the country.
Now, so you say your father is from First Nations, your mother's from European descent. I myself am Métis, and I found at some point I had an internal conflict of some sort wherein I wouldn't be here were it not for the arrival of Europeans, but with the arrival of Europeans came all sorts of suffering, which we still see today. Did you have any sort of thoughts similar to that? Kind of an internal conflict?
Well, I grew up in Selkirk, Manitoba. So that's a little town for your listeners. It used to be a town when I was a kid. Now it's a city. We've eclipsed the 10,000 mark to make us a city, and way back a couple decades ago. I grew up in a little town just north of Winnipeg, and it is the birthplace of the Red River settlement. The Lower Fort Garry is right there. Where we're recording right now is where the Upper Fort Garry settlement are. Those two fur trading posts are really the birthplace of Treaty 1 and Manitoba. This is where the government was established, and along the Red River is really the birthplace also of the Red River Métis. On the other end, in Lower Fort Garry, what's now the town of Selkirk, used to be a reserve. It was the original site of what Peguis First Nation, what's now known as Peguis First Nation. Our leader was Chief Peguis, who was the very first chief here in Manitoba, alongside other chiefs along the Red River, to welcome the British settlers in, or who we call the Jaganashok. The French, of course, had been here for years before that, but they had married into our communities, and they had joined with and already had been living with us, and in many ways had adopted our languages, adopted our clothing. In many ways, French people became Anishinaabe or Cree peoples, which is where the Red River Métis comes from. When the Anglophones show up, the British, they have these policies of racism, xenophobia. We don't marry into communities. We don't use anything other than English. We don't allow our families and communities to live with First Nations. We build forts that's separated from them, etc. Hudson Bay Company, the Anglophones, then set up a trading post in my community, and eventually over the years appeal to what's then later the town of Selkirk and then the province of Manitoba and the government of Canada to move the Indians off the land in my traditional territory, which was along the Red River, just near what's now Selkirk. So I literally grew up in lands that was my reserve, but I didn't know it because a town had been established in our former sites of our reserve. So in 1907, there was a law passed which forced us off the land to what's now Peguis First Nation, way up in Manitoba's Interlake, hundreds of kilometers from where the original site is. And so I was a refugee my whole life. I had no idea that I was a refugee. I had no idea that the story of the ethnic cleansing that had happened in southern Manitoba, that we often talk about in the Middle East and in places in Africa and Asia, but that ethnic cleansing happened right here in Manitoba. And intense violence took place where a racialized group of people were forced off the land to be given to others, Germans, Scots, British people, French people. And so you can still see the names in our territory of those original removal, Peguis families. And so my community, I grew up in that community. I grew up surrounded by Indigenous peoples. Many of us had stayed after the removal or returned after removal, and yet it was never a reserve. So I lived in a reserve that wasn't a reserve. Selkirk, particularly the north side of Manitoba Avenue in Selkirk, which were all Indigenous peoples when I was growing up. And I grew up at the Friendship Center. I grew up at the bingo hall. I grew up going to camps with other Indigenous kids. And so I definitely had a moment where I asked a lot of questions. But the biggest question that I did ask was, why is it that in Selkirk that this tremendous atrocity had happened, but yet everybody seemed to live together? Everyone seemed to find a way to operate with one another. Like, for example, Selkirk has had a Métis mayor going back decades. Like, name me a Canadian city that has had an Indigenous mayor for decades and everybody votes for them. Name me a place in which I was the president of my high school student council. Name me a place in which a bunch of Canadian kids would vote for an Indigenous kid to be the president of their student council. I would walk down the street and my best friend was a Ukrainian guy who votes absolutely differently than me. Really, him and I, we've been best friends now for 5 decades. Almost 4 or 5 decades. And I've not once ever, we played hockey together, played soccer together. We spent our whole lives together. I think there are things happening in the town that I lived in that absolutely show evidence of violence and the genocide that Canada's perpetrated against Indigenous peoples. But growing up in Selkirk, in this place along the Red River, just nearby to Winnipeg, I saw reconciliation before it was cool.
Would you say that comes down to a lack of othering? There was no, you are this, I am that. It was just, we are.
I would say a large part of it was probably that I grew up very blue collar. Like, I grew up Selkirk was a town where it was mostly people that working at the rolling mill, people who were just blue collar everyday people who were working jobs like labor jobs. So my stepfather, for example, worked for a grocery store, the same grocery store for 40 years, stacking produce. My mother worked in mental health, community mental health, and helped people on the streets and helped people who were suffering from deep mental crisis and reintegrating into the community from the Selkirk Mental Hospital. My father opened up a law practice on Manitoba Avenue, and most of his cases were Indigenous peoples with small-time crime, for instance, being caught with alcohol in public, or being caught maybe having a fist fight or a domestic disturbance. He would handle a lot of really basic, straightforward divorce cases, family law, kids in the child welfare system. I grew up really in a blue-collar environment. I grew up in Manitoba housing when my parents split up. We were on welfare for a number of years. And so I grew up with a lot of people who their number one concern was getting food on the table and making sure you're safe. Racial politics maybe took a back seat to that. But definitely everybody always knew that whenever I entered a room, they would constantly be talking about, back in the day, it was being an Indian. It was not Indigenous. It was not Aboriginal. It was, you're the Indian kid, or you're an Indian, right? Because, half the kids I went to school with were also Indians. It was the most eclectic group of young people you'd ever imagine. And they were like the popular kids of the school. And everyone dated each other, and everybody went to the same parties and played on the same hockey team. And it wasn't in any way through ignorance. It was because people were cognizant and aware that all of us were in this small town, and oftentimes we were in opposition to the big city teams and kids and environment of Winnipeg.
Mm-hmm. So it created a collective among you.
Yeah. It kind of was, I think, in many ways, a template for what I would be approaching, because I think in many ways that's what Winnipeg is into the rest of Canada. I think that Winnipeg oftentimes feels like the small brother. I'm thinking back to on the night that Wabkanu won the provincial election in October of 2023. In his announcement, he said, "Look what little Manitoba did in comparison to the rest of Canada, because Manitoba is different. Winnipeg is different than the rest of Canada. There's no place like this place. Saskatchewan and Northwest Ontario comes a little bit close, but you just don't see the kind of dynamics and I think things that have happened in this place that are truly fascinating, that are truly kind of at times mind-blowing. You see little pockets here and there. You especially see some really pivotal, important things in Saskatchewan, Northwestern Ontario, and Edmonton. You see a lot of really interesting things in Edmonton and BC, sometimes in pockets of Ontario and maybe pieces of northern Quebec and maybe some parts of the Maritimes. I mean, the most fascinating, I think, place in the country, I think, is the North. Where you see the most amount of real, just fascinating, interesting developments and the way people work together. But in Winnipeg, there's this kind of Canadian mentality, but then it's undergirded by a real social justice bend. And I think it goes back to every part of who we are as not just a city, but also as a province and as a what I call Winnipeg, which is named after the watershed. It's really the watershed. For Indigenous peoples, we didn't have provinces, obviously, but what we did have is relationships with space and land. And so the word Winnipeg is not referring to the city, it's referring to the lake and all the things that flow into the lake, which is this massive funnel system created from the glacier age, which creates the Great Lake Agassiz, which covers Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Northwestern Ontario, into the States, into Michigan, Wisconsin, the Dakotas, even into like Illinois. You know, the Great Lake Agassiz carves out the land and then eventually everything flows into Winnipeg.
One thing I found when I was reading your book is I started telling people it feels like required reading if you live in Winnipeg or if you live in Manitoba because of how much history you learn along the way. Maybe some of it's taught in classrooms. I don't think most people could explain that to you, most people living here. So having grown up in Selkirk, were you shocked when you first came to Winnipeg? Was there an abrupt difference between the two places?
No, because I speak glowingly of Selkirk, but Selkirk is a profoundly racist place too. There is no monument to the fact ethnic cleansing happened in that place, that people were forced off the land by gunpoint by the police at the orders of the government of Canada through an unjust and illegal sham political process that they did to take away the land from Indigenous peoples, my community. There's no monument. There's no recognition of that. And only recently have the town of Selkirk, now the city of Selkirk, created an agreement with the Manitoba Métis Federation just to recognize that Selkirk is one of the birthplaces of the Red River Métis. And they finally recognize and acknowledge that relationship and now are building it with some infrastructure and with some, I think, services that the town or the city is providing for Métis infrastructure. And so when I came to Winnipeg, I saw it on an exponentially high scale. Growing up in the 1980s and when I moved into Winnipeg, I was a university student in the early 1990s. 1994 is when I first got my first apartment down Henderson Highway. Driving around this city, walking around the city, taking a bus around the city, you are extremely exposed to the violence that has taken place here. I think it's gotten worse. It's gotten exponentially worse over the years. Like we've never seen the amount of encampments that we have now, or the amount of people addicted or sleeping in bus shelters, or the profound amount of young people either in jails, going murdered or missing, or in the child welfare system. You know, we have a massive problem right now with theft at grocery stores, but we've also had thefts at liquor stores over the past few decades as well. The poverty that we have inherited in this community oftentimes results in people, especially reporters, coming from somewhere else, from Toronto usually, or any other city, and they fly here for a weekend and they interview a few people and they go, oh, Winnipeg's such a racist place, or it's the most terrible place in the world. In fact, we just had a professor at the University of Winnipeg who literally just moved here a few months ago or a year ago or something, and then wrote a piece going, oh yeah, Winnipeg's the most racist place I've ever been. That's only a perspective if you don't understand how it's Canada that is the most racist place, but we have inherited it the longest, the policies and practices of racism. And so we've been impacted the most by those policies, which have then driven up poverty, the legacies from residential schools, from the the fact murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls isn't a strictly Manitoba problem. That is a national epidemic. But we see it perhaps most in places like Winnipeg. And so when we have a tragedy that takes place, like, for instance, the murder of Tina Fontaine, that is not just a Manitoba or a Winnipeg issue. That is a national issue. And thankfully, we're starting to make headway so that that tragedy didn't come without at least some outcome, which was the creation of the inquiry into murdered missing Indigenous women and girls. And so while we have never found the murderer or never convicted anyone of the murder of Tina Fontaine, her death did not go for naught. It was for a purpose in which we, as a country, as a community, began to study the issue in a serious way and come up with recommendations to deal with the profound epidemic of violence that Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit peoples experience. When I came to Winnipeg, I saw this profound racism and erasure and a denial that there's a problem. I also think there's a deep misunderstanding in this place and elsewhere as to where it is that this violence comes from. I think as we've learned more over the past few decades, especially starting in the 2000s, we've learned a little bit more because we train people better. Young people today are being taught on what residential schools are and about Indigenous languages and cultures and traditions. And I think that my daughter's generation, who's 18, she just graduated from high school, is the most competent generation in history. We are becoming more aware and therefore can deal with these issues in a much more competent fashion. So you see, for instance, citizen groups popping up in the city that address violence and encampments and addiction because police will never be able to fix that issue, but community groups can. Local-based community groups who are in the neighborhood who can show love and kindness. That's the Mama Bear Clan, the Bear Clan, Initiative, 204, Sabe Peace Walkers, all of these different groups that have come up in the city of Winnipeg. These are all community-led initiatives that go on top of the fact that organizations like Ganiganichik or Mama Way have been around for a long, long time. Community-based group, often started by women and grandmothers who have been innovative, and therefore I think Winnipeggers are finally catching up to joining with Indigenous peoples to solve this city's most pressing issues, because there is no issue that any of us experience, whether it be poverty, addictions, people sleeping in bus shacks, or affordability or environmental crisis. Like, we're all facing these things together, and Winnipeggers, I think, are more competent than ever to realize that all of these issues are not just problems, but are responsibilities for all of us to fix.
One thing that I've encountered personally that has caused many an awkward dinner table conversation in various situations is a reluctance to accept the reality of how severe residential schools were, the actuality that students died, people were stripped from their families and forcibly removed from, their mother's arms, literally. Do you think that's a matter of people just need to be properly educated, or do people need to kind of accept the reality that the country that they hold so dearly has committed such atrocities?
Yeah, it's really a failure of a series of institutions, almost infinite amount of institutions, but the education system is really at the center of that. But I would call, movies as much a part of that, or politicians or media or the business leaders of Winnipeg. I would call the very people who designed the city of Winnipeg as being part and parcel of this great epidemic of ignorance that we have in the terms of the ways that we've treated one another. Because residential schools gets the lion's share of the attention of violence, of Canada's violence against Indigenous peoples, and should so. What an atrocity to forcibly remove children and put them into the hands of another group. That's called genocide. That's actually the definition of genocide, is the forcible transfer of one group of children to another group of people. One group's children to another group. When that is intended for harm, then that is the epitome of genocide, because it's called the mental intent of genocide. 1948 definition of the UN Convention adopted that principle. Yes, residential schools have tremendous brutal legacies, but it's also residential schools themselves are very complex, because what we're talking about is we're talking about federally recognized and funded residential schools run by churches. And so there's about a few hundred of those. Most of them have been recognized, but some are still seeking recognition definition. And then there's the day school program, which many Métis people attended, as well as many First Nations people who were either non-status or some of them more status or perhaps didn't have access. And then there was also some Canadians, young people who attended the day schools as well. And then, of course, there's the industrial schools, which there's a few handfuls of those, which were schools that were designed for teaching students particular skills, but still forcibly removing them from homes, not allowing their parents to visit, force them into English, force them into certain ways of belief, and so on. All of those systems produce trauma. Even if we talk about the residential school, we have to spend a lot of time engaging the different ways that we talk about residential schools. So I always say that residential schools in schools should be taught like we teach math. For instance, we would never start a lesson in math. Let's say we wanted to teach algebra. We would never start with algebra in kindergarten. We would first off teach people what numbers are, and then we would teach them addition, and then subtraction, and then multiplication, and then brackets, and then, the hundreds of other things that go into algebra, like the equal sign and letters, and then we would eventually in grade 10, 11, 12 get into, x plus 1 equals 9. So x equals 8. So we would get into that. We need to teach residential schools like that. We need to teach young people about value of family and that families look different in different cultures and traditions. We need to talk about Indigenous concepts of land as well as European and Canadian concepts of land. We need to do all of that for years. Then finally in grade 10 or 11, we start getting into the intricacies of what the residential school system is and talk about, there were children that were forcibly removed violently. Their parents were refused. And hey, did you know there's all these different types of residential schools? Here's the churches that ran these schools. And we don't do this because we want to obsess or have guilt or whatever cancel culture is this week. We don't do it because of that. We do it because that is to teach the prototypical Canadian story. And we also have to teach other things too. We have to teach young people about the Indian Act, and we have to teach young people about what does land theft look like, or we have to teach young people, particularly the fact that Indigenous peoples invented 100% everything that we know of as Canadian, from multiculturalism to democracy to healthcare, to the fact that all of our streets are Indigenous trading routes, to the fact that every single penny in our paychecks comes from Indigenous lands and resources, from the fact that absolutely everything in this city, for just as an example, we are right now at the corner of Broadway and Main Street, where we're recording this right now. We are at the site of an Indigenous city called Nestawaya. That city of Nestawaya was a 4,000 permanent city of Indigenous peoples, mostly Dakota, Lakota, Nakota peoples, often called Assiniboine peoples, and then Cree peoples who lived here permanently. And Anishinaabe, my peoples, didn't come, they weren't permanent settlements, but we'd come and trade for what's now called the Forks, and we would marry and we would have relationships. And there's evidence of a treaty I wrote about in the book going back to 1285. In 1285, there was a treaty that involved people from thousands of miles of different directions who all came to Nestawaya to negotiate a peace agreement so that people could live together during a massive continent-wide super drought. That there was no food, there was no ability to grow vegetables and food and medicines. And so people had to make agreements. And it happened right here. It happened right here, just over here in what's now the Ball Diamond, where the Winnipeg Goldeyes play. There was a site right there. The Manitoba Museum has a big display about it, which in 1285, Indigenous nations came together to commit to a peace agreement. Young people should know that. Young people should know that the territory in which they are walking on, there is evidence of Indigenous. The only reason that we are here is because of Indigenous peoples. We're often taught that it is the British and the French people who brought economy, who brought civilization, who brought laws and government. But none of that's true. It was already here. All of that was already here, and that British, French people joined with it. And then learned and eventually made democracy and healthcare and multiculturalism because they learned from Indigenous peoples. They learned democracy did not come from the Greeks. That's the biggest lie I've ever been told in my life. It came from their exposure to Indigenous peoples. And so they saw, hey, this is a way we can build government. This is a way that we can build people to have voice in voting and et cetera. And all of these things then ultimately make better, more competent people in our community. So some of that uncomfortable uncomfortable conversations you're talking about at the dinner table, I think is sometimes evidence of a series of institutions, almost infinite amount of institutions, everything from the movies, from the books, from the classrooms to the boardrooms to the living rooms. All of it was not made available to the education of what truly Canada is, what truly Manitoba is, what truly Winnipeg is. And we are only finally learning the story now in bits and pieces. So it does make for uncomfortable conversations, because when you're 60, 70, 80 years old and you're learning for the very first time something that my daughter, for example, has already learned in school, it can make you feel a little bit like, why was I never taught this? Or how dare you bring this up? I didn't learn that. Or I think particularly that this destabilizes the story that I've been told is the truth. And turns out there's more truth to that truth.
Just blunt question. Did you ever expect in your life to see a First Nations premier in Manitoba or in Canada?
Yeah, well, because I already saw it. I already saw it in Selkirk. I didn't see a First Nations mayor. I grew up around extremely strong Indigenous peoples, and one of them being Wab Kinu's father, Tobasonaquit Kinu, who I got to know as a young university student and spend time with. He was profoundly wise, also complicated, not a person who was perfect in any means, but was a really wise and brilliant person. I would say the same thing about my father, and I would say the same thing about my auntie Diane, who I think was one of the most brilliant people and smartest people and creative people I've ever known in my life. Can bake absolutely anything and handle 36 bingo cards, which, if any of you who know bingo, 27 is pretty remarkable. Doing 36 is brain numbing. Like, you should work for NASA. So I was always aware of the brilliance of Indigenous peoples growing up. I was lucky because during the really hard times in which I was taught a lot of racism in schools, where in that grade 6 social studies class that all I was taught was Indigenous peoples were footnotes or problems or wearing loincloths and throwing spears, and that's all we ever did that was of any value, and that we can find, if we can go outside and find a few arrowheads somewhere, and that's the evidence of Indigenous presence, or that Indigenous peoples never did anything else. I was able to say, well, that's not what I see. That's not what I experienced. And that's absolutely not what my father is all about, or my aunties, or my cousins, or my uncle who headed up the Friendship Center in Selkirk, who was really the person I idolized my whole life, was my uncle. So did I expect to see a First Nations premier? I didn't expect to see it in my lifetime. I would just say that. I grew up in the 1990s, really. And so where you still could go in entire industries, we're not talking about workplaces. We're talking about industries. Like, my dad was appointed the very first judge, Indigenous judge, First Nations judge, in Manitoba history in 1988. We had never had a First Nations person on the bench before that. Just imagine that. How many judges in Manitoba did we have before 1988, going all the way back to 1870? We'll say a few thousand, maybe, and not one Indigenous face at all. When I was growing up in the 1990s, we were still first Indigenous person in an industry. When I was hired as a teacher, I was a high school teacher in Winnipeg School Division. I was the first Indigenous teacher in the south end of Winnipeg, basically on that side of the river. There was a residential school there called the Assiniboine Residential School, the only urban residential school in Canada, which is down Academy Avenue. But for about 60, 50 schools in Winnipeg School Division, they had never seen an Indigenous face at the front of the room, ever. And so that meant that I believed in the ability of incremental change. And I certainly wasn't the first Indigenous teacher of Winnipeg. That had happened for decades before that. Helen Settee and Myra Laramie and Mary Young, just really remarkable Indigenous women and grandmothers who had fought very hard to enter the education profession. But it was still small. The steps were very small. I grew up to see kind of what Indigenous peoples could assemble in politics, which was a lot of just presence, like entering into rooms and shifting that room, engaging the racism of that room. And the evidence, probably the best example in Manitoba, is Elijah Harper in 1990, who stood up against the Meech Lake Accord. and said that the Manitoba government cannot pass this law because it does not include First Nations people in Canada's constitution. And then you see kind of other people that are doing really amazing things like Oscar Laughlin and Eric Robinson. And these are MLAs in Manitoba. And then eventually you see the first First Nations women that enter into politics and then Métis politicians. But I never thought I'd see one at the top in my lifetime. I knew it would happen, but I didn't really know it would happen so soon. But I think that when Wab Kinew entered the leadership race for the Manitoba New Democrats, I think I was aware, because Manitoba only goes one of two parties. And there would be a time in which probably Wab Kinew was going to become the premier, because when you're head of the Manitoba NDP, there's really only two choices in Manitoba with respect to the Manitoba Liberal Party. But there's really only two choices. So I thought there'd be a decent chance. And that was a few years before he became premier.
And the whole time I've been aware of Wab Kinew, I've only ever seen him as he's well articulated, he's very intelligent, but, and this might sound bizarre, he seems like a human being. He doesn't seem like a suit and tie looking to tell you what you want to hear in order to get a vote. He seems like an actual guy. And I think in part that has something to do with, when he released his biography, he was very honest in it. To come from a place of hardship and recognize that he didn't want to be on that particular path and that he chose to change course. For me personally, that really got through to me. It really, he's not a politician. He's just he's a human being is what that changed for me.
Well, I've known Premier Kinew for decades. I've known, because our families are very close, and our families, his parents and my parents joined together to create the first Anishinaabe-Moin daycare here in the city, or I say they call it a Montessori school now or whatever. But it's basically it was a school built to build children in fluency in the Anishinaabe language. And so my sister attended, and Wab Kinew was one of the attendees as well. He's slightly younger than me, so I've known him for a long time. Let's be honest, Premier Kinew is also from the media. I mean, his first real job, other than with respect to his music career and other things that he may have done along the way, his first real job was working for the CBC and doing media work, and then eventually working for Al Jazeera English and doing documentaries. And so he certainly knows communication, and he knows the vitality of what it means to put out a message. So I think his famous How Do You Do, Wab Kinew is a good example of that. He knows how to get a message to the public, how to have it have resonance. Absolutely, I hear what you're saying when he is definitely a human being. He'd be the first to tell you that he is not a perfect human being. In fact, his I think the most profound speech in last provincial election in 2023 was, we called it "I Have a Braid" speech, and where he came out at the Canadian Mennonite University and said, "I'm not a perfect guy. I'm a person who struggled with addictions and with the justice system, and but I'm a person who believes in second chances. And I think that everybody in Manitoba deserves that chance and that consideration. We should all think of each other as people who are living together, trying to figure this place out." I think he absolutely is sincere in that message. I also think that it's an election campaign, and he's a masterful communicator. He's a brilliant. I've never heard anybody in my whole life, other than perhaps my father or perhaps other really great orators that I've heard in my life, but who can really capture brilliant moments. And for my most profound moment, I think, was with Premier Kinew, was the night of the vigil for Tina Fontaine, where he gave a speech in front of thousands of people to encourage and to promote collectivity and recognize the life of Tina Fontaine. That speech I don't think was ever recorded, but it was a brilliant, beautiful speech. I also think another beautiful speech he gave was on the night, equally as beautiful as that night, was on the night of the shooting at the mosque in New Zealand, where I was with him at the Winnipeg Islamic Association, the mosque out in the outskirts of Winnipeg, where we're all mourning the loss of our relatives in the Islamic community, and he gave a beautiful speech there too. He's got a lot of abilities, oration. I guess the time will tell of how, and we're still in the early days of this Manitoba government, and I guess we'll see, certainly there are lots of good moves, and I think publicly popular moves, like searching the landfill, exempting the gas tax. I also think that we've been able to move inflation in the country in Manitoba with the financial choices that have been made here, never mind the climate of change that's happened in the healthcare system, which I've experienced firsthand, my mother just going through the healthcare system. I think that the time will tell whether that popularity will stand, because all governments are very popular at one time. Justin Trudeau was very popular at one time. Certainly evidence, though, shows that in one of the most conservative ridings in Manitoba history, the place that birthed two premiers, the riding of Tuxedo, the former riding of Gary Filmon, longtime Manitoba premier, and Heather Stephenson, less long time, but certainly most recent Manitoba premier, that the NDP won that seat with a relative unknown person running for them, who was a nurse, Carla Compton. That's an anomaly. Something very unique is happening in Manitoba, because most of the premiers in this country are right-wing premiers, especially with a fairly center-left federal government. Manitoba decided not to go that direction. That's interesting.
Just a quick point on what you say about, we're in the popular phase. I always like to keep Brian Mulroney in mind with that. When he was elected Prime Minister of Canada, it was the highest popularity rating of any PM at the time. And when he left office, it was the lowest popularity rating of any PM ever.
Yeah, ask Kim Campbell about that one.
Just on the topic of Wab Kinew, one thing that I heard a lot of people saying when he was first elected, and even before he was elected, was he's just going to spend money on First Nations people. He's going to pay, essentially, all his interest is going to be on First Nations issues. I think it's fair to say there's a lot in that regard that should be addressed. What do you have to say to anyone who argues that Wab Kinew would spend too much time or too much money addressing First Nations issues?
That is the perfect example of what racializing is. No one, when Heather Stephenson started, said she's only going to focus on women's issues. Nobody said when Brian Pallister started that he's only going to focus on tall people issues or issues from people from Portage la Prairie or rural Manitoba issues. Like, nobody said that. What's the difference? What's the difference between those three people? The difference is race. We have a long-standing history in Manitoba of treating Indigenous peoples of all walks of life, I too have been treated in this way, as lesser than or incapable, or we are only there because we are of a certain racial group and we suddenly feel bad about it. I can remember a really famous story of my father, who was appointed to the first Indigenous judge, first First Nations judge in Manitoba history, and he was having lunch one day with other judges. They were all sitting together. And of course, my dad is the only racialized person in the room. And so he's sitting with a lot of judges who are very privileged, very rich, very distinguished, but male backgrounds, and of a certain racial groupings anyways, that come from the Caucasian background. One of them turned to my father in a very intense disagreement they were having and said, "Oh, Justice Sinclair, you're only here because you're First Nations and we feel bad." And my father retorted back to this very well-known judge in Manitoba, said, "Well, you're only here because you're white." Think a little bit about that, because who would be probably more right in that scenario? I think the reality is Wab Kinew is not a person who has ever said that I'm going to only deal with issues involving Indigenous peoples. But the fact is that as Premier of Manitoba, we should be paying more attention to Indigenous peoples, because the fact is that we have neglected Indigenous peoples as a provincial responsibility for a very long-standing time. In fact, what that leads to is a whole lot of ignorance. There is a reason that the last two premiers in Manitoba have been removed due to their intensely incorrect views of Indigenous peoples. Brian Pallister was removed because he simply doesn't understand history, and he had a revolt in his own party because he said that settlers came here only to produce good things, which is just inherently incorrect and deeply ignorant, and spreads falsehoods, which then leads to him saying things like, "Oh, Métis people are only there shooting guns at night and have no respect for anybody else," and whatever else he's decided to describe about people, Indigenous peoples who hunt. Heather Stephenson weaponized Indigenous women's bodies during the provincial election. Both of those premiers were removed because of their incorrect, outdated, and divisive statements on Indigenous peoples, and rightfully so. And I think that any other person from the Conservative Party who, if they were to take a lesson, don't say outdated, incorrect, and divisive things about Indigenous peoples, because that's 20% of the electorate in Manitoba. Never mind the fact that the other 80% is married to, sitting on a bus beside, or is working with Indigenous peoples. They're best friends with Indigenous peoples. Why would you say such incorrect, divisive, and racist things? Now, are there people who do think that Wabkanu is only going to focus on Indigenous issues? Here's what I would say to that. I would say that we should be focusing on Indigenous issues, because the fact is that when Indigenous success happens, everybody benefits. Like, for instance, the urban reserves in Winnipeg. That results in property values increasing. That results in billions of dollars of investment that doesn't go to Sweden when we give tax breaks to multinational corporations that rhyme with Bibia. They take their money and they go elsewhere. Hudson Bay Company exploits our community, takes millions of dollars of profit, builds an atrocity of a building in the downtown, and then just leaves the first second they can't make profit. Who then inherits that building? It's a Southern Chiefs organization. As usual, it is Indigenous peoples who are cleaning up the mess of those who come and exploit this place. And we might be better served to realize that by joining with Indigenous peoples, working with Indigenous peoples, oh, and by the way, the most pressing issues in Manitoba are going to be involving Indigenous peoples. Lithium, the fact that we need to deal with fresh water, and water is included in a treaty right or an Indigenous right. Or the reality is that the largest growing workable population, employable population in Manitoba is going to be Indigenous. Nobody grows faster than Indigenous peoples here in Manitoba. And who do you think is going to fill in all those jobs and pay all those taxes and take care of all of us when we're in the old age home?
When it comes to the Hudson's Bay building, I'm very excited to see what the Southern Chiefs do with that building, in addition to if Portage Place is acquired, as it is currently on the books to, by True North Sports and Entertainment, just to see what we can do to help revitalize downtown.
That's a perfect example of a partnership that needed to happen. So the Southern Chiefs organization do not have the business acumen to be able to develop the Hudson Bay building, and to be able to expand and have their business interests to be as expansive and profitable as possible. That's not an insult, by the way. I mean, there's only so much you could do. True North has that expertise to give the business acumen and support and network and to help the Southern Chiefs. True North doesn't have the contacts in the Indigenous community to be able to deal with what will be the most pressing issue in taking over Portage Place, which is that it's almost exclusively an Indigenous population walking through that building. Huge swaths of the Indigenous world comes through Portage Place and literally lives downtown. Don't let anyone ever tell you that people don't live downtown. People live downtown, but they just don't live in apartments. They live in tents. And so the fact is that if you're going to be downtown, you have to have contacts with the Indigenous world, and True North doesn't have those contacts. So that's a perfect example of what Winnipeg is looking like. We need each other. We need to work together. And that is a really good example, I think, of what my book is trying to point out.
Well, I got one more question for you. I don't want to keep you all day long. And I went down to the Forks on Canada Day, and you see a lot of red shirts, you see a lot of Canada flags, you see a lot of happy, smiling people. But you also see a lot of orange shirts. You also hear a lot of drumming. I think there was a throat singing performance in one of the main buildings. And so in the last, I guess I would say 10 years or so, there's been a real reassessment of Canada Day, what it means to people, who celebrates even. A lot of people choose not to celebrate. What does Canada Day mean to you?
Well, I spent, just to give a little shameless plug, I spent it actually at the stadium. They've renamed it the
Princess Auto
Stadium, where the Blue Bombers play, and the team put on a special Canada Day event to try to include, I think, some of their messaging. Two of the most important things is that Indigenous artists were significantly a part of the main stage and all the music throughout the day, the performances throughout the day, the Walking Wolf Singers and Coco Stevenson and that crew. But then there was also an Indigenous artisan market, which was probably the most popular part of that day. really remarkable things happening throughout the city at places like the Forks, but also throughout other elements of the city, Assiniboine Park as well. The reality is that, Canada Day is a complicated day for us. I've written that Canada Day is a day that's very triggering because most of us have been taught that the maple leaf is this beautiful syrupy sweet, something you put on your pancakes. It's this like goopy, loving, gorgeous thing you should never question and just have a few bites and just feel warm inside. The fact is that the maple leaf is red because it's blood. People have died to create this place, and they've been killed. They've been murdered for this place. People have been removed. People have experienced deep intergenerations, multiple generations of violence, of poverty. That's not even happening yesterday. That's happening literally as we're talking right now. We can look out the window right now and see people who are suffering from what people have done in order to have the houses that they live in Charleswood, Tuxedo, Transcona, Maples, Garden City. That's not to fault anyone in those places, but it's to realize that there's been a cost for this tremendous wealth that one group of people have accumulated and another group of people have been shut out of. And so I've never been a fan of leaving anyone behind, and I don't think Manitobans are either. And the evidence of that is that they voted in a government that refused to leave Indigenous women's remains in a landfill from an admitted serial killer, and that we as a community believe that's important to us. We decided to vote in a government, the majority of us anyways, that would go and search and make sure that no one is left behind, and that I think Manitobans are people who are good. There's a reason that we have Friendly Manitoba on our license plates, and I think it's because people who came to this place learned from each other, lived together, and made families together. And we have a lot of learning to do, and we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we live up to those visions, whether we call it treaty or whether we call it the Manitoba Act or whether we call it being neighbors and family. We have a lot of work to get to that place and to arrive, but I think that we also, I see incremental changes and steps in that direction far more than I see steps away from it. In recent years, I've seen some of the biggest steps towards it. I've seen 15,000 people cheer for Indigenous languages at a Winnipeg Jets game. I've seen a grand entry powwow dancers bring out the football team in our community, and 30,000 people cheer that on. I've seen workplaces commit to territorial acknowledgements and to working with Indigenous procurement to bring businesses alongside and support them. I've seen young people like my daughter be voted valedictorian of her class by Canadian kids, immigrant kids, at the largest urban public school in the city of Winnipeg, which is right beside a Jewish synagogue, right beside a Catholic private school. And my daughter was a First Nations valedictorian. I think that's Winnipeg.
Wonderful. Well, Niigaan Sinclair, thank you for coming on today.
Yeah, miigwech. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening. This podcast was brought to you by Matthew Harrison and Ryan Funk. Tune in next week for another conversation from the heart of Canada.